4, 3, 2, 1, and we are back with the Art of Move podcast, episode 15. We are here with my friend Lucas Aaron, who is also known as Range of Strength on Instagram. He is, in my opinion, one of the foremost experts on flexibility training and incorporating that seamlessly with strength training. In fact, I wouldn't trust anyone else to really coach me through how to get a super heavy back squat and the splits at the same time. Lucas, I'm really stoked to have you on here. And we're also here with Dr. Will. Dr. Will is a chiropractor here in Banff. We've been co-hosting the Art of Move podcast. If you've been listening on Spotify or iTunes, we've talked a lot about a biomechanical approach to training and a biomechanical approach to movement. But if you want to get strong and you want to get flexible, there are better ways to do it than most strength and conditioning. I think Lucas is a real innovator in this space, and we're really, really stoked to have him on. How you doing today, man?
Doing great, guys. Thanks for having me. Excited to get into what I love the most.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what is it that you love the most in terms of training? Like when you think of your training philosophy as a whole, I know you're very passionate about it. What would you say is your guiding principle for training, and what goals do you approach your training with?
Strength. Always strength.
Right. And even more fundamentally, how are you defining strength in this situation?
Strength in my philosophy or mindset is the ability to move freely through whatever capacity we want to, or the situation may arise, and to be able to do so with expressions of strength. So, when I say strength, I don't necessarily just mean like a squat or what you see in the gym, but strength to endure whatever comes upon you. So maybe, I guess, one simple example would be the slip and fall. So you roll your ankle, your knee slides or moves. You have the strength and the resilience to withstand that. And, your training is a direct outcome of that. So that's, I think, when I think about, obviously I have a passion for strength training and the traditional, lens of approaching strength that way. But even still, the more I get into it, it's always comes down to why I do what I do is for those kind of things, and why I help people, with improving their movement and flexibility is so that, they have the strength to endure whatever comes upon them.
Well, and I know, Will, you've had a lot of questions come up for you as you were kind of exploring Lucas's stuff for a little while. I took Lucas's Range of Strength coaches certification program last year into this year. Like, I think I started it in December of last year, and I took it well into, and that was like, honestly, that was a mind-boggling experience for me, because I had some serious shoulder injury from doing CrossFit, and my body was always feeling jacked up. And even though I felt strong in terms of being able to move weight and move numbers, my overall strength in different ranges, I could maybe force myself into different ranges. What I was shocked by, and I think it was the 12 weeks that we did that program, was how good my body felt no matter what I was doing. And that was, and that's what I kind of hear you talking about, is like, it doesn't matter where you're at, you have the ability to express strength in whatever position you end up finding yourself in. And that was really kind of what I felt, was like, man, if I was bending over to grab something, if I was lunging down to grab something in the kitchen, or as a basic thing, or if it was winter and I was slipping around, I slipped a lot, and I would, like, normally that slipping motion would make me feel like I was pulling my groin. But all that middle splits work that we did, like, I had so much strength in those areas that, like, even if I like flew off onto one direction because I was slipping on the ice, like, it didn't hurt. I was able to control myself in those positions. So there's that, there's this utility in basically, like, movements that happen every day, but also movements that you don't want to find yourself in necessarily, that you injury proof yourself from. Essentially, that was my personal experience that I had. And Will, I know you have a lot of questions. What's like most on your mind when you think of, because you're relatively new to the flexibility world from a biomechanics perspective, what are you fascinated by with this approach?
Well, I kind of want to just ask what type of populations you work with. It's probably lifters or power lifters. And what's a typical program? Run me through, let's say I was a power lifter or Olympic lifter, what would a program with you look like? And what are the goals?
It's funny you say that. I came to kind of releasing range of strength and like a lot of, you know, my teachings and what I wanted to teach to the world with that lens on of like, I want to work with lifters and weightlifters, but I didn't connect with those people. And I still am not connecting with them as much as I would like to. So my population is more sedentary or older population that are looking to restore their bodies and start moving better. That kind of has probably become more of a focus point for me in the last year, especially with the basics. That really connects with those people like, hey, I restore my range and get into the basics. But that population of weightlifters and stuff, it is growing. And I think it's also just because I put myself in that environment a lot. But training, most people are surprised when they start my training methods, as I'm sure Anthony can probably say, even though his was from a teacher training perspective, is that we don't stretch a ton. We really learn how to stretch and we understand the skill of the stretch, but we learn to earn the stretch. And we earn the stretch through different approaches to strength training. So you could look at it as simply strength training is basically, I call it range of strength protocols. So protocols are kind of like a circuit of strength movements and different positional movements. You said you're familiar with FRC, so you'd be familiar with getting into end range positions with the body and creating like an agonistic type activation, irradiation type movements. So in that kind of organization, we create some conditioning. So a lot of times in my experience and with myself and with working with people is most people don't even have the condition to actually stretch. So it's kind of funny that we always turn right to stretching is like, oh, let's stretch. And it's like, well, you can't even stretch yet because you haven't conditioned your body to actually get into these positions. So I approach it from that perspective, is trying to create space to then use the space with stretching. So the basics program is very much reflective of that. There's lower and upper body sessions, and the individual warms up and runs through these circuit type protocols where they then learn to use that space to lay new tissue down, actually be in a stretch and do something and create new end ranges. Does that help?
Yeah. So are you using positions? Let's say I looked at your Instagram. I saw, the horse position that you're working from. Is it a series of positions like that to get a person to understand how to create tension? Or are you thinking more along the lines of joint capsules like FRC? What is the thought process behind the end range and what a person's supposed to feel at that end range?
So the basics are compromised of stance, fundamental stance. So we can think of fundamental stance as things as like a horse stance or long lunge. These very ancient exercises that have been around forever. That's would be one piece to it. Trunk flexibility. So this is another area that hasn't been tackled quite as well as it could be, is like teaching people how to actually create flexibility of the trunk. How does the trunk extend, flex, laterally flex, and how do we progress someone to do that safely? Capsule strength, shoulder and hip capsule strength. I mean, that's really a focus point of the FRC training system. They really bring that to the limelight of like what type of capsule strength we need. My approach is a little bit different to the degree where it's maybe not as overly emphasized, but it's a piece there. We're also looking at folding strength. So folding strength, reaching for your toes. How can we do that in a way that we express it with strength rather than, a stuck passive type position? Then we're thinking of groundfulness. So if you did say you're into Goda, so you'd be familiar with resting postures on the floor, seated resting posture positions. And this is the concept of the resting posture. It blows people's minds because a lot of people just can't sit on the floor. So my thought process behind that is that training should be an outcome of better results in that rather than just sitting on the floor. So again, kind of with that perspective of conditioning the body to create space, we then would use that space to maybe get into a resting posture on the floor. So I call it groundfulness. So your ability to actually be on the ground, get up and down off the ground, the resting postures play a role there. Then we have hanging. So being able to actually hang the body off of, a bar or whatever. And it doesn't have to always be hanging that produces strength in that result, but like how we're addressing the ability to hang, our grip strength, things like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of different pieces to the basics, but it's organized in a programming way where there's upper and lower body days, broken into planes of motion. So sagittal plane days and frontal plane days, and shoulder spine days, and ankle grip type focus days. So it's organized in a very traditional way. Like, I think if you come from a background of working in the field, if you see the way I organize flexibility, you're kind of like, oh, this is kind of just like strength training. But it's using all of these kind of approaches to come together to improve flexibility.
That's huge for buy-in too.
Yeah.
As a chiropractor, I know what to do. It's really hard to get people to buy in sometimes. So if you have
Right.
it pre-packaged right there, it's how they did it before. That's amazing. Anthony, do you have anything to add to that? Because I know you did.
That was one thing that I noticed about how you were programming, even in the the coaches training, was I was like, oh my gosh, this is like I feel like I'm doing a powerlifting style periodized program right now. It was like the sets of 5, for these end range things. I was like, oh my God, of course, like we're doing like a 5x5 because the principles of strength are still the same, right? Like if I can do a 5x5 and still jack up my squat, why couldn't I do a 5x5 in these hard end range positions that are a similar level of intensity and effort and get that strength in the same way? That was something that really struck me. Was it's like, okay, so when most people think about flexibility, and this was me too, I spent years doing a lot of yoga, and I did a little bit of gymnastics training, but I would do Christopher Sommer's gymnastics bodies program, where he would take you through a 45-minute stretching session. Essentially, yeah, you would do some movement, but it wasn't organized in a way that was, I could get great results in any hypertrophy or strength program. Give me a barbell and some dumbbells, I'll improve my strength. But when it came to flexibility, it was like I was doing yoga and gymnastics for years and making marginal progress. For me, the paradigm shift that I saw with you when I started doing it was, okay, cool, I can actually program range and flexibility the same way that I program strength, because they're the same thing. And I think that's kind of, what set you apart for me when we were doing that coaching and that experience was like, okay, flexibility, range, these are all things that are conducive to strength. Like you're literally just building strength in a different pattern, in a different capacity, so that the principles of strength don't change. Mm-hmm. It kind of reminded me of, one of the criticisms I heard of people who train their abs, for example. Like bodybuilders will do like sets of 8 to failure, but then they'll do like hundreds of crunches but the abdominal muscles are still trained in the same way. Like they're still muscles. They still, adhere to the same principles of hypertrophy or strength. Range was the same thing. And that was kind of what boggled my mind. It changed the way of how I thought you could actually program for the result of it, right? And it's very, you can apply the programming in the same way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think connected with you too is like knowing what you're training for. And that's, I mean, we don't do anything unless we know why we're doing it, right? So yes, you're going to improve your flexibility, but at the end of the day too, it's like, well, how are we measuring that? And, measurements of flexibility is so outdated. Like there has to be upgrades on how we're actually measuring an individual's improvements in flexibility. And that concept and teacher training that was presented, which is it is a program that I use now, is called Feats of Range. So we talked about, there's feats of strength, and people get very, attached to a feat of strength, like a squat or a press or, things like that. Well, it's the same principle when we think about flexibility training in that same perspective, like feats of range. Okay, well, splits. well, we're training for splits, but there's different levels of that. So, like we're understanding that side split is adductors and piriformis, and we're understanding front split is hip flexors and Achilles and quads. So, and when you start thinking about the feats of range that there in our teacher training, we talked about the big six. There was like a big six that kind of encompassed the whole body. You can actually start to then think about how you better organize flexibility training to move towards measurable targets. And that's where I talk about milestones. Like there's certain milestones you kind of want to hit from a beginner level, an intermediate level, to then think about like, okay, do you actually want to train for that feat? Because it's a totally different, step in the journey. Is like, you're not going to take an athlete and say, let's train splits super hard, but you can use the fundamentals of training side splits to give them really nice programming for adductors and groin and stuff, right? So that's what needs to happen with flexibility training, and that's what's missing is an organization of it where it can fit into traditional training models. And that's, I think, where a lot of people get like, lost in like, I don't want to give up all this other stuff I'm doing. You don't have to if you know how it kind of all fits together.
So, you have these milestones, and I agree that was one thing that was really useful for me. I think it's important to have clarity in terms of the direction that you're going to. As much as I am like, I agree with a lot of the principles of, biomechanical approaches like GOTA and functional patterns and WEC method. A lot of the times, the things that loses me from my conventional strength training mindset that I have is like, okay, this is cool, but how am I quantifying my progress? Like GOTA has some cool ideas where it's like, well, you just see how consistently are you keeping your inside ankle bone high, and how consistently are you keeping these biomechanical patterns, but actually having things that you measure very quantifiably have been really, really useful for me. That's the biggest actual challenge that I find with fully adopting a biomechanical approach to training is that if you just say, well, it makes you move better, there's little quantification about that, and that's the challenge that I kind of have with it for the most part. For your sort of North Star and your standards that you have for, what are your basics that you think everyone should be able to do, versus what are the things that a person would basically have to specialize? What are the feats of strength or the feats of flexibility that you would have to go all in to sort of get to?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like just going back to what you said about like the biomechanical model, that fits nicely in the sports and athletic world because they always know what they're training for. They're training for performance in sport, right? So a reflection of their measurable success is based on performance in sport and how they move. And then, the challenge for kind of the everyday person is like, well, I don't play sport, so I don't know. Like that, there is an imbalance there too, but still there should be some measurable kind of approach to flexibility. I believe everyone should be able to palm the floor in a standing fold with the right approach to training. It's not something that's foreign. And I think that there's certain degrees of motion in those fundamental stances that can be hit by the large majority of the population. Your grip on a bar and how you articulate that. We used to do that in the military, so we would measure grip strength from hanging on a bar, but you can do that in an active position and a passive position. So like being able to actually express it and show that you have the ability to control the surrounding bones and structure of the body when you're hanging, not just hanging on a bar. Like you can hang on a bar and your arms are bent and you're all, but that's not really a passive hang, right? So we know there's differences there to active, passive type hanging positions. Trunk flexibility. See, the trunk flexibility stuff, that's where kind of feats of range really works well in thinking about a back bridge or what a back bridge encompasses, right? So it's that extension of the spine. So how can we measure that? Well, there needs to be a certain degree of range in the shoulders. We can think about certain trunk flexed positions that we can measure. Like I do use back bridge as a measurement, but I would even think that it can be broken down further to how someone can segment their spine and actually, improve that ability. The capsule strength stuff, like I've actually gone more back to, particularly with like hip capsule. That's the one that we need to start measuring, I think, because everyone's doing all this hip capsule work, and it's like, well, how much do you need to do, and what's a good measurement of like maintaining it? Because if you've been in that FRC world, you're doing hip capsule work for an hour and a half is not really realistic, right? And like, why and how much should I be doing? So I've gone back to the martial arts world just through influences. Like when Anthony was doing teacher training, I brought in one of my mentors to do a demonstration of martial arts work, which was very grassroots. It's like just stances and positions. So I think even just being able to articulate your hip capsule strength in just standing static positions, like a side kick, and that can be broken down into a half side kick with internal and external rotation. There's good measurement there, and it's simple. And, once someone hits a certain standard in that, you don't have to spend so much time doing that kind of stuff. So those are some things that I think are like, there's 12 milestones in the basics program, and that really, active and passive ranges need to be assessed, right? So seated pike lifts goes hand in hand with standing folds. Once you get into the system, it all makes more sense. And you see how things kind of connect together. So those are just some of the basics.
So you mentioned martial arts and applicability there. I'm trying to get a higher kick, let's say, right? And this is actually something that I have an issue with. I can kick low. As soon as it goes belt and above, I have to warm up a little bit, right? And I'm cool with that, but I do want to get a little bit higher. How would I go about doing that? Would it be an isometric hold at the top of the kick? Or would you go into, let's say, a more traditional stretch, a passive stretch or an end range hold with weight? What are you doing to get me a higher kick?
Combination of passive stretching, ballistic stretching, which would be more isolated with stretch kicking, and static work. Obviously, we should measure certain basics, like what is your current hip rotation ability? How's everything functioning, and trying to reduce any imbalances that are there. But that's a simple approach to that kick strength or that kind of demonstration of flexibility. And most people don't really, unless you're just practicing kicking, they don't understand the stretch kick methods, which is a little more Shaolin, old school type approach to ballistic stretching. So with that, there's a lot of static ability, but it's also about leading the leg rather than throwing the leg. And when we think about leading a leg, it's about applying velocities at certain points of the movement. So when is it that I should kind of finish the kick? When is it that I should apply more force? Looking at your stance in terms of like a side kick position, the stance is going to affect to what type of degree you can actually open up the hips into internal rotation or external rotation. So if you make sure you have the right stance, you're going to be able to actually create that space you're looking for to find a higher height. Learning how to tilt. So that's a whole different approach to like your torso strength. So now you need oblique strength and torso strength. You have to learn how to actually tilt. But yeah, you could think about, like, again, the range of strength protocol system, I could put these things into that for you to create something that improves your kick, right? So that thought process of like rotating agonist and antagonist movements that are applicable to the end goal and applying that traditional strength training type model. I think that's, just most of this stuff, people just don't know where to find it or how it actually works together.
That's great stuff. And what you mentioned there is along the lines of what we've been talking about here. It's the biomechanical model, where to place the bones, what works with what fascially, what's spinning at what point, right? So That's great stuff there. Let's say in terms of warming up for CrossFit or something like that, do you have a protocol that, would be beneficial for someone doing CrossFit or, Olympic weightlifting right before they actually do their activity? How could you improve their warm-ups is basically my question.
Well, it does come back to that original thought process of like a dynamic warm-up. Like I do go back to that old school thought process because most people just don't even do that. It's been around forever. And then you look at a dynamic warm-up and like how it's being broken down. Dynamic flexibility warm-ups, like swings, kicks, and static holds all fall into that category for me. So creating a little series where there's certain leg swings with static holds paired together. That would be a simple kind of, most of that stuff's missing. And again, most of today's population can't even hold their leg up when you try to get, so everyone's trying to do double unders and then you ask them to stand there and hold their leg out straight and there's cramp city and they can't do it for more than 10 seconds. And it's kind of like, okay, let's start here. Let's, just start working with some basic static positions and learning how to swing the legs and accelerate the legs and the arms as well too. I would just start with something very basic like that. But most of my warm-ups when I do one-to-one work with clients in terms of, again, organization of a session and saving time, I usually go with either static stretching first or static stretching after the dynamic flexibility work. And then I do some inner range work and then we get to work. Like we go right into the session. So something global, some dynamic flexibility, some static static stretching, and then the inner range work where it's just like short range kind of pump flow stuff, legs or upper body, depending on the session. So that's typically how I'll flow a warm up. And the flexibility sessions usually kind of look like that too. So it doesn't really change much.
That's great.
One of the things that we kind of talked about, we had a whole episode on fascia a little while ago, and we kind of talked about how some traditional static stretching, especially prolonged static stretching, can possibly decrease the elasticity of fascia in the long term. And we want elastic recoil in our fascial tissue. Our fascial web is kind of what keeps our movement efficient. And I know that there is a lot of dynamic flexibility. A lot of the kicks and stuff I felt more bouncy and elastic while doing the protocols that you were doing. Is that something that you think about? Is fascial elasticity as well when you're doing this range work, or is that not a consideration?
Well, I would follow, it wouldn't be prolonged work in the warm-ups. So in the warm-ups, 30 to 60 second static stretching pairs really nicely with dynamic flexibility work. And most of that research is very isolated to like athletic populations where we're looking at like 1/3 of a second on a sprint being shaved off, when you're dealing with most of the people you work with aren't really even capable of sprinting. So are we really worried about, that hurting them or affecting them when if they stretch before they get into positions, they're just going to have better positions, right? So try to have, both of those lenses on when considering these things. But like the prolonged stretching stuff has to be there. It's the stuff that will create the most change. It's just where it should be at the end of a session, or as I said in the teacher training, on a completely separate day, so that we actually learn to experience it and learn to be there and understand the skill of it, because there's contractions that need to occur during a stretch. There's a breath. There's a certain timeline on our stretches on how we move deeper into the stretch. That's the kind of stuff that I want to see people getting into more so outside of like, it is nice to have buy-in, but you don't want to have buy-in to the point where you miss that stuff. That's the stuff where it's like, you have to do this. Like if you really want things to happen and get better, like this is the stuff that has to be done.
Okay. What about moving in? You mentioned ballistic stretching, right? What does that look like for you? The reason I ask is because on the fascial end of it, I'm under the belief that whatever range of motion you have, if you want to turn it into a better motion, you need to have elasticity at that range. Okay. And I have certain ways to train that in. Is that a consideration for you at all? Or what's your ballistic stretching look like?
Yeah, so this would be that thought of guiding the joint or limb versus throwing it, right? And that's what's missed.
Yeah.
No one really even knows what ballistic stretching is, really. What ballistic stretching is to me, and the application of it, is knowing when to accelerate the speed of movement. So it should happen at the end range, but an individual needs to understand, okay, I can get to this end range here, and then there's going to be a little ballistic action. So there has to be some warm up to that. When we think about isometrics, overcoming versus yielding isometrics play a big role in ballistic stretching because it can really prime you for that end range before you think about accelerating in the end range. So if you can, we talked a lot about the end range strength concept, which it kind of gets misguided when people think about end range strength. They think about just taking heavy weights through an end range, when really it's like, no, get to an end range. Learn how to be in that end range, learn how to accelerate in that end range. That's to me what end range strength training is. And that would be my approach with ballistic stretching, is getting ourselves into this end range position, warming up, and then learning to actually guide the limb or body at accelerated speeds through that end range.
What about, let's say, a boxer who wants to accelerate the punch on a hook? I'm going to share my screen. Actually, I'm going to show you how I do it, and I just want to hear your thoughts on this. So basically, cool. I want to work the fascia around my pec. My goal is to make that tissue elastic and recoil really fast. Okay, so I want to make it extra elastic. This may be a specialty thing with boxing. I don't know that a regular person would want this, but let me show you here, and I want to hear your thoughts. Oh, that's yours. So you'll get it as soon as I start doing it here. So basically, I'm just twisting from side to side. I'm going to get my pecs in action. And I'm also using the elasticity from my hips eventually going into this. And then eventually I can use this to propel movement. You got what I was doing there just from that, eh?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a rotational exercise.
So basically I had 5-pound weights and I'm trying to recoil at the very end. Okay, wait till the elasticity comes in and accelerate out of that. Okay, and I'm accumulating reps because it's very easy on the body. And at the end range, my tissue is doing that. What would you say to something like that?
So that's my thought process as well too, is like when to accelerate. So the guiding principle there, guiding the joint and then accelerating, learning how to do that. Like I would, looking at that exercise, I don't know if, I guess maybe I would go right into that, or if I'd have some kind of preparation for that. But it makes sense with what you're saying. I have the same thought process in terms of like when and how we accelerate. But I would be thinking about the end range of the stretch position having an acceleration point before coming back down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So then I guess there's that agonistic control. Like when I get to that point, it's like, so rather than just throwing the weight there, I'm guiding it. When I get to that point where I know I'm going to come back down, I'm actually going to apply that force to go further back and then coil back down.
Interesting. You're applying force when you're at the end range to go further back.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, I mean, that's where you need to be the strongest.
But in something like boxing, you don't have time to, like in a match or when I'm throwing that, I don't have time to do that with my muscles. Will it be automatic if you train it, is basically my question there.
You'll be more resilient if you train it to some kind of overstretch. So you actually learn to overstretch with your own strength. So I mean, that's where
so you're saying do it slowly, and then you wouldn't train it that way ballistically. Meaning,
no, I would.
You would.
So I think basically what I'm hearing too, and you know, because I went through the process myself. I did some of the kicks where you're partway up the kick and you start accelerating to get almost even more range. Will, where you're almost looking at the turnaround point as this contraction, so you have that elastic snap. What Lucas is saying is when you're about here, then you would continue to accelerate even farther, so the range is extended even more. And you're pushing yourself more out into there. So it's less of a focus, Will, where you're focusing on the recoil and contracting to accelerate back down. There's, when you're partway through, Lucas would accelerate to extend the range even more. And there's the natural elastic recoil that happens anyway, right? So you're using the natural elastic. And that's actually, you know, because I've done those rotational movements that you do. That's actually how I practice that movement, is I'll accelerate into that recoil and I'll let the natural recoil kind of happen on its own. We even talked about that recoil in previous episodes, how we think that's not even like a conscious thing that we do. That snap, that elastic recoil is not something that we're flexing to initiate. But if you're pushing yourself into that extended range, the elasticity will naturally happen anyway.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Like I'm definitely willing to experiment. I mean, that's why you're on right now, is to get to these conclusions. I played with this for years, right? So it's something I haven't tried, and I'd love to hear more on how to do that. You know.
So a lot of those principles, Emmett Lewis took me through a lot of those stretch kicking principles, where so we're thinking about, before the stretch reflex can occur, we're actually applying some force, and then like basically guiding our end range with strength. So it's like I'm learning to actually, instead of just throwing my limb back, I'm learning to actually pull it back, and then actually leverage that recoil to come.
So what would you say is actually activating to get you there?
So our stretch reflex, it has to activate, but my thought process with the stretch reflex is like trying to actually control it rather than throw into it, or just like, you know, like actually control our ability to apply the stretch reflex. So I have the same thought process when I think about squatting as well too, is, you know, having that control to the very last point, where you then learn to create that recoil and optimize that stretch reflex with strength, rather than, I guess, collapsing, or again, that kind of throwing versus guiding kind of thought process.
So where, Will, you might be using the momentum of the weight to carry yourself into that range. What I'm hearing, Lucas, is you'd be using the antagonist muscles basically to pull yourself, guide yourself more into it. Even though it is a ballistic way, you would be using that control to accelerate yourself further, essentially. Yeah. I'm using my upper body because I can't really do kicks right now. But that's you know, it's basically you're not using momentum, you're using the antagonistic muscle pairings, right? You're using that to guide yourself into that range, even in a ballistic way. So as you're kicking, you're pulling yourself up, you're pulling in through your hip flexors, your quads, all the abdominal muscles that are contracting to pull that range in. You're not just letting the momentum of the leg kind of arc in that pendulum. You're actually guiding that pendulum yourself, and you're choosing to accelerate at a certain point. Maybe in that turnaround point where that pendulum swings down and it starts to swing up, that's when you would start kind of adding that acceleration so that you can get further into that end range, and the sort of stretch reflex, that elastic recoil, will still happen automatically. You can just have it in a deeper range.
And we can think about regressing that further to the end range liftoff kind of concepts. So obviously that kind of practice with the ballistic stretch right away would be something we should maybe look to measure someone's strength and ability to be in those end ranges and actually create an agonistic contraction before trying to teach them how to dynamically guide the limb through that range. So this would be a good time to think about, okay, well, what's he doing there? He's in this position, and he's so we could just lay on the floor in a T position and lift the arms off the floor and start trying to evaluate that agonistic strength to actually do that. So to that degree, if someone's has a big deficit there, we maybe wouldn't choose that kind of ballistic work first, but maybe have them learning to develop that strength there with some regress dynamic movements. That would be a thought that I would have with, learning to be in that end range in terms of like the ballistic action of it.
I agree. Most of what I start with is control based. FRC principles, really slow controlled motion of the joints. Make sure the joints know where they are and your brain knows where they are. And then we can move on from there as a template, right? So it sounds like a lot of what you do is getting a bigger template for movement, allowing ranges to happen. Is that the case, or do you look at it another way?
No, that would be the case. Like, I mean, it's a simple kind of movement assessment, I guess. Before I throw someone's limb, can they actually express the ability to control it?
Sure.
Can they control it at the, those kind of spaces before we do something dynamic with it? Yeah.
So do you feel that there are more, well, I guess it's not the right question. I know there's both neurological and tissue adaptations that happen in flexibility training. You can really feel that, like obviously I've been in both camps. When I first started, I thought it was all tissue length. And then I learned that, it's partially neurological adaptations where your nervous system will allow your muscles to extend and access these different ranges. And, do you find you emphasize one over the other? Do you find that there are situations that you have to emphasize one over the other? And how do you think about like the tissue adaptation versus the nervous system adaptation thing for flexibility?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where intensity comes into the picture, and it's very easy to measure intensity in strength training with weights because we're measuring it by putting weight on the bar. But when a lot of the process is happening internally, it's harder for us to get better measurements of like, how intense should this stretch be? How far should I be in the stretch? And I presented that RPE model of flexibility when we did the teacher training, where it was kind of a meathead approach to it, but I'm a power lifter. So, but it's the same kind of concept where you can just learn to better explain the intensity. So if we're at a 7 on the stretch, we know that we're able to hold the stretch with some discomfort, and we can finish the whole prescribed set. Obviously, when we start thinking along these lines, there has to be a lot more practice involved in stretching. So an individual needs to know that this is going to take a little while to understand how to control a stretch, and to know what degree you should be stretching at. So it's good to have numbers that explain what you should be feeling. It's good to also have basic rules of thumb. Like one of the ones I always use with students in prolonged stretching is that we have to hold the stretch for 30 seconds before we try to move deeper, because the process of the stretch sensation kicking in has to happen first. Some people may even prescribe that longer, but 30 seconds in the stretch, we're learning to breathe and be there, let the muscles elongate, let the stretch sensations kind of start to kick into the body. And then we can start thinking about how much deeper we should go into the stretch, and all the other things that should happen after that. So yeah, there's definitely, I think when it comes to the neurological process and that kind of breaking things down, like it's learning to understand what's happening in the body and how we can measure that and explain that to somebody, because stretching is just no one really wants to be in a stretch because they're stretching too deep right away, or it's just uncomfortable. But a lot of the times the reason being for that is just that there's no one qualified to explain the process of stretching to them. So it's just kind of like do it or don't kind of thing.
That was one thing that I really admired about you, was the fact that you didn't just give exercises as is. You're like, all right, here's the protocol, go. You had to explain the actual sensations and some of the things. There's a mental side of it, right? You actually experience your body as you train, right? And the actual experience of going through these movements or stretches is something that's very, very important too. You like, if you just give people this template, it's like, these exercises will work if you do them, right? Like that, maybe. You have to feel them in the right ways, right? And so when a person is feeling into a stretch, or a person is feeling into range work, like I remember doing the head to toe stretches and wanting to puke every time. Like I would finish those. It would feel like I just did like a set of 20 rep squat with like 300 pounds on my back. I would get up and I would literally feel like my whole nervous system just go, bleh. And that was like actively trying to relax into it and still doing the pulses. But then after I endured something like that, being able to relax into a stretch was way easier as well. So when a person is, let's use static stretching as an example. If a person's doing a static stretching at like an RPE 7, right? And you're not doing like maximum intensity stretching, you're just doing a longer static stretch. What are some of the breathing patterns and some of the sensations that they should be actively focusing their mind towards?
Oh, depending on the stretch, I think it just helps to learn to count your breaths. So like if you're able to actually take a breath in and have a 3 count or a 4 count, I mean, that makes all the world of difference for someone who is experiencing like discomfort or the alert of being in a stretch, like not wanting to be there. Getting someone to, contrast breathe nose and mouth, putting focuses on that. And even depending on the stretch position, starting to teach someone like diaphragmatic breathing techniques that can make all the difference in those things. So, measure the person's willingness to learn and, like what the outcome is going to be. But, basic things like that can make all the difference.
Will, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, like, I mean, I could get into how do you view transegrity? Let's say, if you're doing splits work, how do you account for the lines of fascial pull getting really long in let's say in the lower body, and then having that pull come from the upper body? Is that something you take into account? Like looking at the body in a full transegrity model, is that something you do?
Yeah, absolutely. If like we're looking at the levers of the body, when we think about something like the splits, the orientation of the pelvis, it's going to play a role if we don't have the current flexibility or body awareness to create a posterior tilt or an anterior tilt. So considering someone's body angle can create better orientations of the hip. And that's kind of one of the bigger breakthroughs with most people when it comes to splits training, is knowing that it's okay not to be completely upright. You're going to have a better progress if we learn to leverage the upper body, create better orientations of the pelvis to get a better stretch. And this is where people are like, oh my God, a lot of people don't even know how to tilt their pelvis. So that could be, a primary focus for an individual. Is like, I've been training splits, and then they start sending me progress, and they're completely upright, but they have no ability to rotate the pelvis. So it's just a matter of, okay, we're going to actually start by just leveraging the torso to create better tilts and orientations of the pelvis, so we can learn to be stronger. And that can make all the difference a lot of times for individuals. So definitely, I think when it comes to high intensity positions, we have to consider the whole body and how the upper body is going to play a role in being able to access certain positions in the lower body, and how that's going to look and feel for somebody, and then thinking about the anatomy of someone's hip. They might not ever be able to get to that completely vertical position that they desire, but they're able to get in a really nice position with maybe the torso forward and and experience a really nice side split type stretch with the pelvis presented in an anterior pelvic tilt. And that's more important than Van Damme between two transport trucks. You know, it's just, I think that's
so
yeah,
that's
sorry,
go ahead. No, after you.
Yeah, let's see, I kind of lost my train of thought there on what I was going to ask, but in terms of results, you were mentioning people send them to you. What are some amazing results you've seen, you know, and what are their goals when they were presenting to you?
Splits is a pretty cool result. I've had quite a few students obtain splits, and it's pretty uncommon. Like there's a lot of, you know, books to splits out there, and it's just like, you know, it's a guide, but like coaching somebody to obtain a feat of range like that, I mean, it's not just a program. Like that's why I call the splits program, it's a guide, because there's an ebook, there's a program, and then there's actual mentoring with me, because sometimes you have to be counseled mentally to, like, you know that the intensity has to be, you know, progressed over time. We're not just going to get into splits. How do we control splits positions? It's a process. Like it is a process of counseling and coaching and troubleshooting, you know, other things. One client of mine, JP, if you've probably been on my page, you've seen him. He is an aesthetics guy. He was a physique competitor, and he still is very much into physique. He approached me almost a year and a half ago, and was like, I want to get the splits. And he hasn't stopped. And he's, you know, there has to be someone that really wants to get to that stage, right? Like sometimes it happens over time. Like someone starts with the basics, they get the palms of floor pike, and then they start seeing there's a bigger picture here and there's a lot more potential. And then next thing you know, they maybe start chasing splits. But he wanted splits from the get-go. And he's made amazing progress. He's obtained a full front split, which I think his front split's better than mine now, like super square. And again, it's cool to see like a male reach these standards, because there still is that like bias to, you know, gender, you know, like females are more flexible than males. And it's like, you know, it's bullshit. It's just tradition that men just don't participate in those type of activities. And for the most part, it's like, we just haven't taken the time to learn how to do it. So it's cool to see a guy like JP get to the point where he's at now. He's got a full front split. His side split is close to calves to floor, but I keep telling him to work on his calves and just really get the calves big so that he gets them to touch down. But that would be, you know, seeing someone obtain a split or get really close in splits, like that was a really hard journey for me. 3 years to side split. That's, you know, there were times, you know, you want to give up and you don't want to do it anymore, and you kind of go in and out of it, and you have this hate-love relationship with it. That's the coolest thing to see, someone obtain a split.
That's awesome, Anthony.
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of the things that I want to say for the people who have been listening to this podcast for a while, they've heard us mostly talking about biomechanics and have been discouraged maybe about some of the things that we've talked about, some of the negative impacts of say conventional lifting and strength and conditioning. The reason that I wanted to have Lucas on, or one of the reasons, there are many reasons that I wanted to have Lucas on, is I think the way that he approaches strength training with flexibility so well integrated into it is that you can avoid most of the pain associated negatives of heavy strength training. A lot of my squatting, even though I don't put as many axial loads on my spine as much anymore, when I focus on heavier lifts or heavy squats, having the range and the strength in the range to access these positions has basically made me avoid some of the pitfalls that are associated with training causing pain. ultimately we're trying to find the best ways to move. We're trying to find the best ways to feel good and live in our bodies, and having control over these ranges while also still strength training. If you're an iron addict, if you cannot give up the barbell, but you still want to be pain-free, you still want to move really, really well, I think this is like, I think Lucas has one of the best solutions, because you're focusing on, you know, controlling your body in all these different ways, and not sort of neurologically locking yourself into these sort of patterns that you would end up locking yourself into if you were, say, just specializing in squats and lunges, right? If you're doing conventional strength training, one of the negative impacts I find is, like I said, holding yourself in these neural holding patterns, because you're so specialized. Your nervous system is getting such a strong input on these like sagittal plane movements, and you don't have control in ranges outside of them. So I think, you know, if you still want to be a lifter, you know, if you still want to lift weights, but you still want to feel good in your body long term, I think this is a really cool way to approach it. A lot of the things that we've talked about, if you have been listening to the last however many episodes that we've done, this is episode 15, I think, we haven't talked a lot about weightlifting as a viable means to have longevity in feeling good in your body. Like, but I think, again, if you don't want to give that up, you still want to be strong as shit, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, and I'll even just add to that. This year, I have become a very devoted student to biomechanics, and particularly the PRI, Postural Restoration Institute. And I've been taking some course learnings through them that have helped me substantially. So I think they both go hand in hand. And a lot of like what I've been learning with my pelvic biomechanics and things like that has helped me a lot this year with like, I've got all this flexibility now, and it still is this process of learning how to use it with everything in my body, not just muscles, and, you know, it's like everything. So I think that there's a world where everything kind of comes together if we want it to, and we really, you know, like what you guys are doing, even just with, you know, all the work on the biomechanics side, and then bringing me in to talk about this in a way is like, you know, bringing these things together and making sure that we don't ever kind of like think that something is, you know, useless, but how can you use it in your own kind of way? And I will say that, you know, PRI has really helped me a lot this year with understanding my breathing patterns better, and how to use my pelvic and hip mechanics in my squat. Like, it's improved substantially just with, you know, bringing my flexibility together with those thought processes. So, you know, I think they're both super important.
Yeah, this has been amazing. I wish I would have found your work 4 or 5 years ago while I was still lifting. I think I would have had major breakthroughs, because I used to just think heavyweight will just throw me down into gravity, and it worked, but it was a lot of pain, right? And I think I could have done it a way more intelligent way. And the truth is, most people still lift, still want those benefits from lifting. I'm the anomaly here, so. Your work is fantastic. I love what you're doing, and yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you're talking about with what we were talking about with ballistic stretching. So love to have you back, and yeah, that was great stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I've put a lot of the. I was just going to say a lot of that teacher training stuff that I did with Anthony is on the membership as well. I just don't advertise it as much because I'm not really in a position where I can take people through it like we did in the past. But there's, you know, all of that stuff is there, like, for just going through and like being able to go back and forth and, you know, talk a little bit deeper about it. So,
and that's where to get your deepest work.
That would be right now, yeah, where to get everything.
Yeah, if you go to rangeofstrength.ca, you can purchase one of Lucas's Range of Strength memberships, where you can have access to a bunch of different programs. He has the basics, the bend don't break, feats of range, the strength to stretch. That you have all kinds, the squats and splits. You have so many programs on there, and you have access to the Range of Strength community. What's that?
I'm narrowing it down a little bit.
This is right?
The other thing is too, like there's a whole community of people who are looking to explore this stuff too, right? So if you wanted to join the community, it's only $59.95 Canadian a month, which is pretty amazing. And then you can download the app and train with Lucas on one of his programs, get access to the community, send in pictures to get some stuff sorted out. And one of the things I love about you, Lucas, is how much personal attention you do give to the people in your community. You're not going to just throw a program at them and then say, have fun. If people actually want to have help. I know that's why you started the community. We talked about, how important that interactive element with you and that guiding element is actually important in terms of learning and mentoring around this stuff. So go to rangeofstrength.ca if you want to learn more about Lucas's work and you want to work with him. I think he's easily one of the best coaches to work with, not only from quality of programming, but also quality of attention that you get as one of his students. And the community is amazing. The people who are invested in this are super supportive. They love cheering each other on. I'm speaking as someone who experienced it firsthand and is about to jump back into the membership to get some of the basics back under my belt before I go into surgery. And Lucas, thanks so much for joining us, man. If anyone else wants to find you, it's Range of Strength on Instagram, rangeofstrength.ca. Anywhere else that you want people to check you out?
I still refer people to the podcast because I think that's 30 plus episodes in there. There's a lot of the stuff we talked about is kind of highlighted in different episodes in different ways. It's a great place to really get into it and understand a lot of the principles. There's a lot of cool guests that are on there too that talk about this stuff that you'll start going down the rabbit hole and finding a bunch of different people that are actually doing this stuff in different ways. So I would check out the podcast as well.
I listened to a couple of flexible and I can't remember who they were, but it was a rotation one. It's gold, found some great stuff in there. So definitely check that out.
Yeah.
All right, guys, that's episode 15 for The Art of Move. Thank you, Lucas, for joining us today. For those who are interested in learning more about flexibility, go check out rangeofstrength.ca and Lucas at Range of Strength on Instagram. Take care, guys.
Have a good one.